Meditative focus bypasses these vortices. And the vortices that we're referring to here are the vortices of the afflictions, of the poisons. And these poisons, these afflictions, are fueled by ignorance. We have a conviction in a sense of separate selfhood. And this sense of separate selfhood has got its own momentum, which we're told in Sutra 9, that this sense of separate selfhood has its own momentum even in the wise. And I think by the wise we can understand the yogi, the spiritual practitioner. So what are we to do about this situation? Well, the traditional understanding of yoga is we need to purify the mind. And you do this by meditation, along with other things. Now, maybe you've done a lot of meditation. I've done a lot of meditation. I did a great deal of meditation, a lot of it within a Buddhist context. And I'm not sure that I have much to show for it, apart from a damaged knee. And if I were to be completely honest about it, many of the hours that I spent in meditation were spent wandering the psychopathic landscape of my mind. And if you've been exposed to the psychopathic landscapes of your mind, then the idea that you can purify them is somewhat ridiculous and unfeasible. There's certainly stuff that you can do with it. You can certainly learn to navigate them. There's certainly things you can do to ameliorate some of its worst excesses. But quite frankly, another approach is necessary rather than this idea of purifying the mind. And Sutra 11 gives us a clue. It points us in a certain direction. Meditative focus bypasses those vortices. It's possible to bypass the mind. Early on in Book 1, in videos 10 and 11, which covered Sutras 12 through 16, we were concerned with practice and dispassion. Dispassion. And this dispassion is with respect to the mind. It's possible to become aloof from the mind. And how do we do that? Well, Sutra 11 tells us it's through meditative focus. And the word here is jhana. Jhana. Now the Buddhists are quite good in jhana. They list 8 particular jhanas. But I'm not going to go into these 8 at this point, because there's no need to. There's no need to. So what is this jhana? What is this meditative focus, sometimes called meditative absorption? But I don't want to use the word absorption because it gives the idea that somehow you're disappearing into some meditative state. This is not a state which you disappear into. There's a very good description of it in one of the Buddha's autobiographical passages. And I'm going to read out one of these passages. It's from the Mahasaccaka Sutra, which can be found in the collection known as the Majjhima-Nikaya. It's quoted here in Sangharakshita's The Three Jewels. And in this passage, the Buddha is talking to a Jain ascetic whom he refers to as Aggivessana. And the Buddha is talking about his own enlightenment and how it happened. The Buddha was the consummate spiritual seeker. Before he became the Buddha, he was the consummate spiritual seeker. He practiced all the yogic practices that were available at the time. He pursued them to their fruition. And finally he pursued the path of asceticism. He became emaciated. He starved himself to within an inch of his life. And he wasn't getting anywhere. After practicing all the yoga that he could, and none of them provided him with anything beyond the human condition. He was at the point where he realized that all his efforts had failed. All his efforts towards spiritual realization had failed. And then he says to Aggivessana, "This, Aggivessana, occurred to me. I know that while my father, the Shakyan," the Buddha came from the Shakyan tribe, it might seem strange that his father was ploughing, because the Buddha was supposed to have been a prince and his father a king. But apparently it was some kind of ceremonial ploughing at the commencement of the sowing season. "I know that while my father, the Shakyan, was ploughing, and I was sitting in the cool shade of the rose apple tree, aloof from pleasures of the senses, aloof from unskilled states of mind, entering on the first meditation," and this is the first jhana, "which is accompanied by initial thought and discursive thought, is born of aloofness, and is rapturous and joyful, and while abiding therein I thought, now, could this be a way to awakening? Then, following on my mindfulness, Aggivessana, there was the consciousness, this is itself the way to awakening." So the young Buddha-to-be, the young prince, was sitting under a tree, watching his father ploughing. He wasn't doing any exercises, any spiritual exercises. But he wasn't caught up in any unskillful states of mind. He was aloof from his mind, or at least aloof from any of the poisons. He'd entered into a spontaneous samadhi, and this is the way to enlightenment. You need to have had that spontaneous samadhi. Perhaps you have. Perhaps there is a point that you've experienced, a time that you've experienced, where you're not caught up in any anxieties, any worries. You're not even thinking. There's a feeling of well-being, described here as rapturous and joyful. So when we talk about dispassion, there's also rapture and joy in this dispassion, because we're free at this point from the poisons of the mind. And it's something which just happens. Perhaps you've experienced it. Perhaps you were lying on the beach one day. The temperature's just right. You're not hungry. You're relaxed. You're feeling at peace. You hear all the noises going on round about. You're not caught up in memories. You're not caught up in anxieties about the future. Everything is complete in that moment. There is simply experiencing going on. Can you remember such a moment? This is what the Buddha remembered. This was the first jhana. There are other higher jhanas. There are 7 jhanas above that apparently. But this first one, which happens spontaneously, is the way to enlightenment. The Buddha then goes on to describe what happened on the night of his enlightenment, which actually took several weeks to consolidate. And it might be worth exploring what happened next, but I'll leave that for another occasion. So this is the meditative focus, which bypasses these vortices. The word here used here is aloof. You're aloof from the vortices of the mind. The important thing to realize is the mind is still going on. It's all going on. That stuff is still going on. But there's a kind of awareness here, which is not being sucked into these vortices. Perhaps this awareness exists between these vortices, if you imagine an expanse of water, there's all these whirlpools, and we spend most of our time in these whirlpools getting sucked down into them. But every now and again we manage to get out of them, and we experience this first jhana, which is the way to enlightenment. So it's important to be able to acknowledge this, because this is the beginning of spiritual practice. It's spontaneous samadhi. It's not something which is realized after eons of spiritual practice devoted to perfection of body and mind. So a very important sutra, because this is our way to liberation.